So welcome to those of you here and anybody who's going to watch this recording later on. We're getting to the end of our journey through the Hebrew Bible, what you and I generally call the Old Testament. And now we're going to grab some interesting collections of writings and spend a little bit of time talking about some books that you may have never heard of, and some of which you'll never read, but they're important for the background that they'll give to us. As we get ready, turn to page 36 in the question book, and let's read the opening prayer together. Eternal, almighty, gracious, and wise God, we praise you for revealing your big truth to us little people. You alone are the one who made and owns all things. You alone are the Lord of history. We honor you for giving us answers to the questions that we ask during our earthly pilgrimage. Above all else, we thank you for revealing your forgiving heart, your wise will, and your eternal plan through the ministry of your Son and our brother, Jesus the Messiah. As we continue to study of your word of truth, empower us to embrace its message with joy and to share it with those around us with love and compassion. We ask all these things in the name of Jesus, the bread of life, the water of life, and the light of the world. Amen. So a couple of strange words, Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. But before we get there, let's go ahead and review the previous lesson, lesson 38 from last time. And somebody start with 38a.
After Alexander the Great succeeded his father Philip as ruler of Greece in 336 BC, he devoted 10 years, 333 to 323 BC, to establishing an empire that extended from Greece to India to Egypt. After his death in 323 BC in Babylon, his generals fought for control of the realm. Eventually, Ptolemy gained control of Egypt and Seleucus gained control of Mesopotamia. Ptolemy and Seleucus and their descendants engaged in many battles until the Romans assumed control of all their territories. There came the day when Seleucus and Antiochus IV, Theseus, sought to eliminate Judaism and replace it with Greek culture and worship forms.
Okay, so here again then is just this vast empire that extends all the way from Greece and down into northern Egypt on the western side of things, and then stretched all the way across what we refer to as the ancient Near East and to the edges of India. And that was originally, for a brief period of time, controlled under Alexander. After he dies, his generals take part of the land. And you think that there would be this sort of agreement that they'd continue to work together. That wasn't always the case. Everybody always seems to have their own aspirations for greatness. Aren't you glad that ends in modern times? Anyway, so people will continue to do what they do. And what we're most interested is this a battle between the Ptolemies down in Egypt, the Seleucids in ancient Syria and Mesopotamia, because the land of Palestine, Israel, the Holy Land, the land of milk and honey, all of that, Judah, Israel, all of that is right here in between these two. And so they battle back and forth. And of course, we looked at Antiochus Epiphanes here, who's going to be the bad guy on the scene. But before we do that, we want to look at 38b to get our sense of the difference between the prophetic appeal and the apocalyptic appeal.
To understand the style and message of the book of Daniel, it is essential to know something about the difference between prophetic and apocalyptic writings. The foundation of the prophetic writings is the covenant God made with his people at Mount Sinai. The problem is the spiritual indifference of God's people. Apocalyptic writings address situations in which God's people suffer under a foreign power, and the message is, stand firm, trust God, he will deliver you soon. Those who wrote apocalyptic literature did so under a pen name at a time when the nation and they themselves were in danger. Because it was essential that the writer keep his identity a secret, he pretended to be a well-known ancient figure writing predictably about a deliverance that was soon to take place.
All right. So 3 lines from the bottom of that paragraph where you see the word literature. Right after that, you might want to insert a caret and write the word often. They didn't always adopt the pseudonym. Sometimes it was just anonymous. But anyway, they often did so under a pen name. And while you're writing that in, again, here are these larger pictures of the sections, the prophets, the prophetic appeal, the prophets looking back to the broken covenant at Mount Sinai, calling the people to repent and warning them, if they do not, that what the future holds may not be at all what you are hoping for. Meanwhile, the apocalyptic appeal is where the God is breaking into people who are being oppressed or dominated by others and telling them that they need to stand firm, that trust that God's going to break through, break the chains of oppression, break the power of their enemies, and usher in the Messianic age. And so 2 very different kinds of writings. And as we referenced last time, there's still some Bible scholars today who will argue that Daniel is prophetic and written in the time in which events and stories take place. And all of the things that it predicts in the future are things that haven't happened yet, and they're going to unfold. Others, and that's the point of the materials here, will make the argument that Daniel was written much later, as we'll see in the next picture, in a time when there's persecution, and it's just pretending or making use of stories back from before to tell what's going to happen. And here's how that works. So with what's called pseudonymous apocalyptic writing, the author's really here in a period of time, but pretending to write under a pen name back here. And what's fascinating when that happens is this piece of history, which are meant to be predictions from this point of time, are actually quite accurate because they're not predictions at all. They're just looking back and saying this is what's going to happen. And then the predictions that come about what's going to happen after here may not be quite as accurate. And so this is a picture that just tries to grab the difference between the 2 styles of writing and how it plays itself out. Questions there? Then our final, no, we got a few more. Somebody take 38C first of all.
Down through the centuries, people have continued to write under a pen name, not merely to conceal their true identity, but also to speak meaningfully to fellow citizens facing threats.
And so pseudonymous writing is not just something that appears once, it continues in many different times and places. Next.
The apocryphal and pseudepigraphical writings contain numerous apocalyptic writings. They speak to situations in which there are 2 forces at work in creation and history: the God of Israel and the foes of Israel. The message is usually that God will soon overthrow his people's enemies and lead his people into the new and final age.
Okay. Now we got a picture with 38E.
The book of Daniel was produced by an anonymous Jewish writer during the time when Antiochus IV Epiphanes sought to abolish the Jewish faith in Judah and replace it with Hellenism. Although the author is unknown, he pretended to be a well-known Jewish personality living during the time of the Babylonian exile. Chapters 1 through 6 tell ancient stories linked to Babylonian, Median, and Persian control to speak to events taking place during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes.
And we'll look in specific at some of these. We have these from chapter 6, right? There's that story about the food and, don't eat the king's pork, don't eat the king's rich food, because Antiochus was trying to force everybody to eat a little bit of pork. There was that vision of the statue with the different parts made of different things. Then the Babylonians were gold, the Medes were silver, Persians bronze, Greek iron, Ptolemaic solution, that mixture of iron and clay. And then this rock, not cut out by human hands, breaks the statue into little pieces, grows into a giant mountain that fills the world, representing, of course, God's at work through his Jewish people, that there will be a time break in and the Jews will be given authority. You got the lions, or not the lions, then the fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego not bowing down to that statue because Antiochus erected a statue to Zeus and wanted everybody to bow down to that. There was the dream about Nebuchadnezzar had at this great tree that was going to be cut down to size. There's the writing on the wall with the hands when they were using the vessels from the Jewish temple. And then finally, Daniel in the lion's den, the most familiar one to us. And what's important again to remember is whether, regardless of whether you decide for yourself, I'm thinking I'm going to go with the view that these stories are written long ago in the time in which they were set, or you say, I think I'm pretty convinced that this was resistance writing and just using those old stories to speak to the contemporary time. What's important to remember is that the history that's being described is the same. And so what Antiochus tried to do is what we want to make sure that we know about. Okay, so, and then even stranger picture, 38F. Somebody want to grab that?
Continues with a prophetic account that covers the next 3 years. The literary device used gave his message in. The message is that although God's people have suffered under the Babylonians, Medes, Persians, Greeks, and Seleucids, the day is coming when they themselves will rule the nations of the world around.
And so you see, again, this ancient Near East up here in the corner, and we hear about the Babylonians, we hear about the Medes, we hear about the Medes, yeah, then we hear about the Persians, then we hear about the Greeks, and then we get to the breakdown of that empire where horns fall off, and now we get to Antiochus and his threats against the Jewish people, and then finally this divine breakthrough in which God's going to kind of smash their enemies, and they will be king of the hill. Okay, so these kinds of things, again, is that stand firm. God's not going to permit Antiochus the opportunity to end things in that way. So this is a series of stories that are set as visions that carry into that time. Questions there? The final picture in that unit was from 38G. I'll read. Chapter 8 describes the Greek Empire destroying the Persian Empire and gaining control of the Mediterranean world. Chapter 9 states that when Jeremiah predicted that God's people would remain in Babylon, exile in Babylon for 70 years, he really meant 70 times 7, that is 490 years. Although God's people were not really rescued from foreign domination in 538 BC, things are about to change. They will soon be rescued from foreign domination once and for all, and they themselves will soon rule the nations of the world forever. Chapters 10 through 12 speak of the struggles between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and the rise to power of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Chapter 12 assures those who lose their lives in opposing Antiochus that they will be restored to life and given a special place in the coming Messianic age. And so these latter chapters, even though they're in some ways more difficult to read, and all seem to end their focus in and around the time of Antiochus, which again is part of the reason some, but not all, scholars will say, yes, that's more evidence that this is when but we saw the breakdown of these pictures, right? There's this two-headed ram, that's the Persians and the Medes, and now there's this goat with one giant horn, and he breaks it down, but then that horn gets broke and 4 other horns rise up. There's the 4 generals, And then out of one of those generals, out of the sides of the Seleucids, comes this one horn that thinks it's real big shot. That's Antiochus. And it's crossed out finally at the end to say, God's got things under control. Just hang in there. God will bring his stuff to an end. Here's that 70, not 70, but 70 times 7. So the 490 in terms from the Babylonian exile to the end of the Greek control, and they finally get to be free. Again, the numbers themselves are more symbolic, not exact, but that's the sense of it's not as long, it's longer than you think it's going to be, but it's not forever. And then this kind of predictive stuff about what's going to happen to Antiochus and how he's going to die. This was a prediction more in the future. It didn't actually happen in this way, but yes, indeed, Antiochus finally is dead. And the Maccabees will rise up at that point. So, and we read about that in the previous chapter. So 38H, 38I. Somebody can read both those.
Although historical problems surface within Daniel, concern for historical accuracy takes second place to its message encouraging people to be faithful to God, no matter what the cost. Daniel was given a place in the Hebrew scriptures toward the close of the 1st century AD, after Jesus' ministry. However, when Jesus spoke to the people of his day, he told them not to seek dominion over others in a brutal manner, but to devote life to serving others.
Thanks. So here again, what I do find sort of interesting is no matter which viewpoint gets expressed, the basic truths of the stories are still the same. And that's where I always kind of find myself. I'm kind of settled here, but you know what? If I'm wrong and it's here, the basic truths are still the same. So that gives me some comfort as we go. But any questions? So now, Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, and let me make my video not so blurry here for a minute. So it'll be a little easier to see, I think, in the recording. In fact, I'll even stop the share for a moment. That your Bible, if you are a Protestant, has the Old Testament that's about this thick. And then the New Testament is about this thick. And all Christians have exactly the same New Testament. But for Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians, they also include some books called the Apocrypha by us, and they're simply incorporated into their scriptures. And it's roughly the length of the New Testament. So we're going to be talking about the Apocrypha, books that you might have access to, and maybe even have had a chance to look at. The Pseudepigrapha is a different story. And these two books contain the Pseudepigrapha. And not all the writings that you have described in this Unit 39, this is more than that. So there's even more than what we're going to be looking at, just to give you an idea. But this is a more of a specialized field. So these books were, I looked up quick, they were published in 83, so they're already pretty old. And maybe there's some newer versions or newer translations, but you can access these in libraries if you're ever interested. I have not read much of the Pseudepigrapha. I have read the Apocrypha. Maybe you have as well. But as we go back to the slides now, we're going to pick these things up a little bit, and let me get rid of these signals. So turn to page 118, 119, where you're going to find some things that are there. First, I stuck these slides in here. We have been following, by and large, the Jewish structure of the Hebrew Bible, which is what Protestants refer to as their Old Testaments, and Roman Catholics have these books plus the others. And so remember, we've been sort of following along in the Jewish order with the law, the former prophets, the latter prophets, and the writings. The Christian structure, the Protestant Christian structure for the Old Testament looks like this. We talk about history, poetry, major prophets, minor prophets, and I just changed the words around. You can see it goes from Christian structure to Protestant order. It's probably a better way to say it because we wouldn't want to suggest that our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters or our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters are not Christian, right? And unfortunately, you'll hear some people use that kind of terminology. I think that's greatly misplaced. So now I call it the Protestant order. It's exactly the same picture. I just overwrote the words and couldn't make the font match. So this was as close as I got. So this is the Old Testament as you and I and other Protestants would typically arrange it. The Roman Catholic version looks like this. And so after Ezra, Nehemiah, they have the books of Tobit, Judith. They'll have Esther instead of the Esther we have. They'll have Esther with all the additions that we'll look at. And then that's followed by 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And you've got something that I'll show you this in a minute. Then right after Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, as it's called, is where wisdom and Sirach will appear. And then, I just got to move my picture out of the way, right after Lamentations, right before Ezekiel, and by the way, in some older versions of the Bible, Lamentations is the end of Jeremiah. So, but anyway, right before you get to Ezekiel is where the Baruch will come with the letter of Jeremiah included with it. And then instead of the book of Daniel that we have, they'll have the book of Daniel with all the additions that we will look at. Okay? So this is sort of how, if you were looking in a Roman Catholic Bible, you would go, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Tobit, Judith, Esther, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, etc. Okay? So let's look at some of those themes. And by the way, there is a handout I gave you that the front side says apocryphal deuterocanonical books in various Bibles. And if you flip it over to the back side, I have the Old Testament order, the standard Old Testament order for Roman Catholics. And you'll notice then that in all caps, bold print, are the books of Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, or sometimes Ecclesiasticus, then Baruch with the letter of Jeremiah, Daniel, and those are all the bold print, bold caps. Those we don't have. And then notice Esther and Daniel are still in bold print and highlighted, but they're not in all caps because some versions of those show in ours. So anyway, just a little tool there that may be of some use, and we'll actually look at another chart here in a little bit. But before we do that, let's look at the themes that show up, because if you accept the view that Daniel was written about 165 BC, more or less, during the time of Antiochus, then Daniel is the last written book in the old, what we would call the Old Testament. And then the New Testament writings start to emerge in the maybe Mark right before AD 70. So there's roughly 200 years of time between the end of your Old Testament and the beginning of your New Testament. And the letters of Paul, probably a little earlier yet. But anyway, there's about 200 years, but there's not to think that aren't writings going on. And the reason we're spending time looking at writings that you haven't had a chance to read is the people that we encounter in the New Testament would have either read or at least been told these stories. These would be familiar to them. They start to become background noise is a little unfair, but they start to become a part of their story and their understanding of life. Couple examples. We are still now some years removed from the COVID pandemic, but we still see effects of that, right? As they measure kids in school who had to go from live in classroom to virtual school. They're still seeing the effects of that. Or go back a little further to 9/11. That date didn't mean anything 50 years ago. We'd say 9/11. Well, what's that mean? You know, but everybody knows about 9/11 and the changes. If you've flown in an airplane anytime from then to now, you know there's this whole new screening process that is involved, right? So those are a couple of events that happened in the near past that still have had an impact in the world today. You could argue that World War I and World War II and the Korean War and the Vietnam War still, or the Great Depression, or the more recent economic downturn in 2008, 2009, still have impact, right? So the sense is that these writings that we're going to be looking at were inside the Jewish brain and a part of how they thought and a part of how they dreamed and a part of how they structured and ordered their lives. That's why we're spending some time trying to get to understand those. Make sense? We're going to do a lot of reading out of our book. And so this first illustration, illustration 39A, tries to get at some of those themes, some of those thoughts, hopes, dreams, wishes, these kinds of things. So somebody read point 1 on page 119.
Star of David over planet Earth. The cherished hope is that the kingdom of God will soon break in, and when it does, the people of God, the Jewish people, will be given dominion over the nations of the world. Some hoped for the restoration of the Davidic dynasty in some form.
So throughout these writings, both the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, there's this sense that God's coming. And we saw it even in Daniel. God's coming. And when God comes, these people who have been so bad and awful to us are going to get it. And we're finally going to be in a better place. Make sense? So, Jewish Star of David overneath the world. What is the next one? Let's see here. Can I get there? Here we go. Somebody read the next one. Who is being in control? It's the Romans who take control in 63 BC. Prior to that, it was the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and then the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans had a little bit there. Somebody read point 2. Excuse me.
Shattered Greek helmet, broken Greco-Roman column. When the kingdom of God breaks in, the cultures and military might of other nations and kingdoms will be shattered.
So this is their reality that you see up on the screen, but the hope is, boom, God's going to show up and break all that stuff down. Next one.
Symbol for sin, ? Cloud. The post-exilic community debated the question of the origin of sin. Many traced it back not to the events described in Genesis 2 and 3, but to the events described in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Some argued that God created people with an evil disposition, but then gave them the Torah so that, through obedience to its law codes, they could overcome evil and develop a good disposition within themselves, and so make themselves acceptable to God.
So one of the themes is that the Yetzer Hara, that's the evil, rebellious self, if you follow Torah, it'll become the Yetzer HaTov, and the good disposition. So this sense that God is going to be at work. And then look at the angels and demons. I'll read. These writings that were produced during this period contain numerous references to angels and demons, even so much as giving names to them and differences in rank and order. So these writings often talk about angels and demons and archangels and certain demons of different kinds and different levels. You're going to see some of these things show up. Here's another one with the scroll and the lamp. Jason, go ahead.
Scrolls, lamp, symbol for wisdom. The Old Testament contains a number of wisdom writings. See Unit 36. The Apocrypha contains two major wisdom writings, Ecclesiasticus, or the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, and the Wisdom of Solomon. The Pentateuch, which, according to Judaism, God dictated to Moses at Mount Sinai, was thought to be the supreme example of wisdom. Some personified Torah as wisdom.
So here you have the lamp for wisdom, scroll symbolizing the writings, and then off to the side, you've got the sense of the law being, the Torah being that sense for us. Okay? Another theme. Somebody take this one. Number 6.
Tombstone at ground level, 2 skull-filled rooms below ground level. Apocryphal and pseudepigraphical writings contain numerous references to life after death. After death, all go to Sheol, the abode of the dead, a shadowy underworld where all connections with God are cut off. Although some look forward to the eventual resurrection of the body, not all shared this hope. As time went by, some taught that there were compartments in Sheol. The righteous would enjoy bliss while awaiting the day of resurrection, while the wicked would experience pain and agony.
So death has been there all along, but these apocryphal writings begin to talk about the realm of the dead, and there's a sense in which there are the unrighteous dead and the righteous dead, and it's going to be different for them depending on how things play out here. And so there's going to be this separation, and you already begin to catch some ideas of what's going to happen in the Messianic age. And then finally, look at this. Ooh, gotta watch. Don't miss it, guys. Wait a minute. Watch the screen here. Boom, 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 boom. Right? Woo! I'll read. Cosmic signs of the times. The breaking in of the new age, the kingdom of God, the Messianic age, would be marked by cosmic signs within creation, death throes, indicating the end of the older, and birth pangs, heralding the new order. There would be cosmic upheavals, such as huge waves, consuming fires, dark clouds, falling stars, changes in the colors of the heavenly bodies, etc. Creation itself would herald the breaking in of the new age. And we're going to hear some of these themes in the New Testament. So this picture just tries to give you an idea of what's happening in these various writings. And now if you look at page 120 and 120 through 122, we're going to grab a few of these pieces in front of you. Okay, as I mentioned, for us in the Protestant Bible, Malachi is the last book of the Old Testament. But if the argument of Daniel is correct, it's not the last one written. And there's this period of time, and how in between the writings of the New Testament and the end of the writings of the Old Testament, there are other writings that are there. That's what point number 1 is. And if you've heard about the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, this is where some of these things were found. Okay, so that's part of the reason that was pretty exciting. Point number 2 just talks about the different words. So you and I, as Protestant Christians, would speak of these books that we're looking at first as the Apocrypha. Roman Catholics would not use that term for these books. They will sometimes call them the deuterocanonical writings, if that's an easier word to spell or say. But the challenge is that the terminology doesn't always have the same meaning in different places. Again, perhaps a contemporary example. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka the Mormons, present themselves as Christian, and they use the same kinds of language that Christians use, but they don't have the same kind of beliefs that Christians have. And so one of the challenges, if you ever have a conversation, if you have family or friends who are Mormons, you'll use some of the exact same words, they won't mean the same things. So that's just, again, another challenge that we have here. And so let's look at this. I'll read. The term Apocrypha, derived from a Greek word meaning hidden. Some scholars suggest that originally the term meant complementary and was applied to these sacred books too exalted to be made available to the general public. However, later it was used to describe books whose orthodoxy was questioned. By the 4th century AD, the word apocryphal became a technical word to describe the relationship between these writings in the Old Testament canon. And the word canon will get picked up here in a little bit. It signified that although these writings were edifying and had value for private study, they were not to be seen as inspired, and therefore they wouldn't be read during public worship. Pseudepigrapha describes works that are supposedly written by some ancient person, but they're not. They're just using this pen name. And they were not admitted into the Tanakh, which is the prophet. Torah is the word for law, Nevi'im, the word for prophet, Ketubim, the word for writings. Those are the 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible. And so that's T-N-K. And so they call that Tanakh. So again, if you have any Jewish family or friends and you hear them talk about Tanakh, that's what they mean when they say Bible. That's their Bible. So point 4, in Protestant Bibles, our Old Testament contains 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New, for a total of 66. And we call these canonical. And canon just comes from a term that means measuring. And so there's no debate about which books are in the New Testament. Nobody's going to add books to the New Testament. It's closed. The Old Testament, from the Jewish perspective, is also closed, but that took some time, as we'll see in a moment. And so that's what point number 4 is referencing and trying to get at the word canon. Somebody read point 5.
Bibles used by Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians contain 7 of the apocryphal writings: Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom, Ecclesiasticus or Sirach, and Baruch, plus some additional passages in the books of Daniel and Esther. The Orthodox also include in their canon 1st and 2nd Esdras and Prayer of Manasseh, Psalm 151, and 3 Maccabees. The Roman Catholic Church uses the term Apocrypha to refer to those books the Protestant churches define as Pseudepigrapha. Hold on.
Yep. Hold on.
Sorry. The Anglican Communion relegates the apocryphal books to the position of an appendix to the Old Testament, includes them in the lectionary, and commends them for devotional use and edification. Reformed communions generally follow the more conservative policy of the Jerusalem rabbis and omit them from the scriptures.
Okay, so guess what? There's argument here how this works. And what you and I would say Apocrypha, well, when we say that, Roman Catholics think we're talking about these. And so you can see where it kind of gets confusing. Scholars are aware of this and can work through that language difference. But for the sort of average Joe or Jane in the pew, if you don't know, it just sounds like it's very, very baffling. but it is important to know. And here's the other piece. Point number 6 at the bottom talks about how before the first century unfolds, Jewish people have made themselves, once the Assyrians dragged them off into exile, and then the Babylonians dragged them off in exile, not everybody came back. And that sort of whole ancient Near Eastern area, there's Jewish people all over the place. And what's fascinating is that Alexandria, which is in northern Egypt on the coast, kind of west of Cairo, Alexandria became the second largest Jewish population in the ancient world, second only to Jerusalem in terms of authority. And you might be aware that in Alexandria, in ancient Alexandria, it was famous with the most famous library of ancient times. And you may also be aware that that library burned down. And there's been all kinds of studies and trying to figure that whole thing out. But there was this tremendous loss. I mean, any history scholar, if they could, if I could create a time machine, I don't know what I'd do to go back in time, right? I might go back and watch the dinosaurs or something, right? But I tell you, most historians would go back with some sort of device to photocopy all the books in the ancient library in Alexandria, because some of those copies have been lost to history. And one of the things that they did, the Jews who no longer lived in Palestine, most of them lost the ability to read and understand Hebrew. And instead, they spoke the common language, which was Greek. And so the story is that the people in Alexandria wanted to have, and the Jews wanted to have, a Bible they could read. And so the Bible got translated into Greek. And that Greek version of the Bible has the fancy name of the Septuagint. And it's usually symbolized, and I don't know if they show it here, with the letters LXX. Maybe you remember your Roman numerals. L is 50, X is 10. So LXX would be 70. Because by tradition, 70, or in some versions of the story, 72 scholars sat down to translate the Bible from Hebrew to Greek, and they each did it on their own. And when they compared all of their versions, they were exactly the same. And so they felt they had an inspired version of the Old Testament in Greek. And because the Jews who lived abroad felt more freedom to incorporate into their scriptures other writings that they found helpful, that's where all these apocryphal writings are found. So still today, if you get a Hebrew copy of the Hebrew Bible, it will have the 39 books that you and I have in our Old Testament. If you get a Greek copy of the Hebrew Bible, it will have those 39 books plus all these books that we're looking at called the Apocrypha. Why? And interestingly enough, when Jerome, who's famous for translating the Bible into Latin, all the documents he used were Greek. So he used the Greek version of the Old Testament. And of course, the New Testament was written primarily in Greek, the Greek version of the New Testament, and that created the Roman Catholic version of the Bible, that the Vulgate is the word they use, still in use today. But when Martin Luther wanted to translate the Bible into German, he went to the Greek New Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament. And so that's why the Reformers don't have those books in. There's your little mini history lesson for the day. Point number 8. Somebody read that on page 121.
process of determining which books should be included in the Old Testament was a gradual one. It continued for several centuries and came to an end only about 20 years after Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Romans in AD 70. Because the Jewish people were now uprooted and had no national home, it was important that they should know what constituted their sacred writings, especially since the new sect of Christianity claimed to be the inheritor of the faith and promises of the Old Testament. The rabbis who met at Jamnia in AD 90 to determine the final list found themselves challenged. The problem lay with those books that had been circulating as sacred writings since the time when the books of the law and the prophets had been officially recognized in about 200 BC. There were various tests to determine which books were to be included in the Jewish scriptures. If a book had established a position for itself by virtue of its own worth, it holds on the affections of the people, its value as a guide to life, and as a treasury of the knowledge of God. It earned a place for itself in the Old Testament. Several books remained on the borderline for some time: Esther, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. Esther was eventually included because of its link to a popular Jewish festival, Purim. Because the holy secular Song of Songs was read as an allegory and given religious significance, it was included in the sacred canon. However, the rabbis saw fit to reject those later Greek writings that had been in circulation abroad, but not in Jerusalem. Books thought to have been written after the time of Ezra, or that could not be attributed to notable characters such as David and Solomon, were relegated to the category of Apocrypha, that is, hidden from use in public worship.
So interesting to know that the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, that's already kind of a little closed, established pattern, 500 BC or even earlier. The writings, or excuse me, the prophets, that next collection of books, they're pretty well set by 200, but that last collection, the writings, didn't get finalized until well after Jesus' time, after the destruction of the temple. And some even argued that Jamnia didn't solve it. Jamnia was just one more argument placed along the line. But eventually, the Hebrew Bible got restricted to those 39 books. But the other books are still out there. And remember, this is long after Jesus' time, so that these writings are still part of the popular understanding. The stories would be told. And as we'll see, some of them are wonderful stories. And you can imagine them being used by parents or others to teach their children some of the stories of their history, right? Not at all, perhaps, unlike, you were told as a child of a famous president who chopped down a cherry tree and had to admit to it. He could not tell a lie, right? I mean, so we tell these stories that are there. Point 9 simply lists that come New Testament times, the temple is the very heart and center, the lifeblood of the Jewish people, and that people from near and far, whether they're still living in and around Israel or further afield, would want to make their way at some point to the temple to offer sacrifice. And the high priest who operated underneath permission of the Roman governor was the supreme religious authority over the life of the people. The party of the Sadducees, who by and large were the privileged priesthood, they supported the high priest and had sometimes a more favorable arrangement, sometimes not so favorable, with the most popular party, which were called the Pharisees. So these are people we're going to have. And the Pharisees would often debate about all kinds of things and would spend lots of times debating little tiny points. But they are basically patriotic and they are very devout. in trying to live out their faith. So that's the environment that we're moving into. Synagogues, there would be synagogues all throughout Palestine, but also at least 150 of them out in the wider world. And anytime a synagogue can be formed, anytime 10 Jewish men get together and say, let's form a synagogue. And that's still in practice today. So in other words, a small group can start a church. Point 11. Cappy with a K. Can you read that?
When we move from the Old Testament to the New, we encounter words and ideas that, although implied in the Old Testament, have not been fully developed. The kingdom of God, the Son of Man, Satan, paradise, Gehenna, angels and demons, and an expectation of a catastrophic end of the world. These concepts began to take shape in the writings of the
Intertestamental. Yep.
period. They reveal what the Jewish mind was focusing on just before Jesus, the Messiah, carried out his radical servant ministry, and reflect the religious spirit that prevailed in the world where the writers of the New Testament grew up.
You might want to put a little star by that one in your books, because sometimes well-meaning Christians who read the New Testament without being aware of the influence of what we call the Apocrypha and or Pseudepigrapha think to themselves, how could these people get these crazy ideas? They're not even in the Old Testament. Well, they come from these writings. And so you get little teeny hints at some of these in our 39 Old Testament books, but you get a lot more of these things in the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. And so all those things that were mentioned, kingdom of God, Son of Man, Satan, paradise, Gehenna, which is the word for hell, angels, demons, all these kinds of things, that's the common literature. And I don't mean to, this is a bad example, right? Because if I said to you, inquiring minds want to know, you're already thinking of the National Enquirer in those racks in the grocery store, right? And then you're just ready to blow that stuff out. That's not what these are, okay? But this is the seedbed. Finally, point 12. We should not overemphasize the importance of the Apocrypha, but we also shouldn't disregard what a major portion of the Christian church considers to be canonical or edifying, right? So here's a little dose of humility. Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christian comprise the vast majority of Christians in the world. They consider these books to be important enough to include in their Bibles. We shouldn't be, as Protestants, so arrogant to just say, oh, they're just dumb. They don't know anything. I don't need to know about it. We're asking for a little humility here. And I love the little phrase here. He says, although, let's read that last sentence together. Although the apocryphal writings do not match the spiritual heights of the Old Testament scriptures, they serve as the historical knot that ties the two testaments together and set the stage for the breaking in of the Messianic age. I think that's just a wonderful thing. So now we're going to get ready to dive in. And so we're going to be looking, and you probably already got a chance to do that. We're going to look at all of these different writings, Tobit, Judith, the additions to Esther, the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, or the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, or the son of Sirach, or Ecclesiasticus, has all those names. Baruch, the letter of Jeremiah, the various additions to Daniel, which include the prayer of Azariah and the song of the three young men, the story of Susanna, the stories of Bel and the dragon. First Maccabees, Second Maccabees, First Esdras, Second Esdras, the prayer of Manasseh, Psalm 151, 3 Maccabees, and 4 Maccabees. Those are the writings between which Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians include in their Bibles. The Orthodox don't include all of these. The Roman Catholics don't include all of these. But together, they've got them all, okay? And now, look at the green or the colored handout. I gave to you. And so I'm sorry for those of you who are catching this only online. If you're at our church, you'll find a copy in your mailbox. I'll make them a little bigger. So this is a chart I found someplace and I thought was really quite interesting. So the titles are simply listed alphabetically, the approximate dates in which they were written, or at least guessed to be written, what kinds of writings are they, what are the themes, are they in the Septuagint, which is that LXX, the Greek version, and are they included in the Roman Catholic Bible? And so you can see, we won't look at all these, but you can see Baruch, guesstimated to be written between 150 and 60 BC, somewhere in that 90-year period. It is wisdom and it's a narrative. It's kind of combination of those. It praises wisdom, the law, the promise of hope, opposition to idolatry. Is it in the Septuagint? Yep. Is it in the Roman Catholic canon? No. Bel and the Dragon, 100 BC. It's a detective narrative at the end of Daniel. It opposes idolatry. It's in the Septuagint, it's in the Roman Catholic canon. So you can see Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Jesus Sirach. There it is. First Esdras, second Esdras. That's not even in the Septuagint. The additions to Esther, the letter of Jeremiah. We'll keep going. Judith, wonderful historical novel. Talks about true worship and patriotism. Maccabee, and maybe you got Roman Catholic friends who are named Judith. This is why. Because of this great, great story. First Maccabees and Second Maccabees talk about some of these themes. Third Maccabees, Fourth Maccabees, the prayer of Azariah, the prayer of Manasseh, those are there. And then finally Psalm 151, not quite sure what the date is. Susanna, another great detective story. Tobit, a wonderful folktale. Wisdom of Solomon. So these are just the breakdown of some of these books that we're going to look at. So this additional chart may be some help to you, and it may be even something you can fold and have inside your Bible. So let's take a look. And hopefully you got a chance to read through the book. If not this word, because we're not going to do everything, but Tobit is a wonderful story. When my wife and I one time went to see a play called Tobias and the Angel. It was a retelling of this story of Tobit. Tobit is a devout, wealthy Israelite who was taken to Nineveh. So that's in that first deportation in 721. And interesting enough, before taking into exile, he only worships and offers sacrifice in Jerusalem. Remember? After Jeroboam, the northern kingdom split, Jeroboam establishes a shrine in Bethel and a shrine in Dan. Well, in this story, Tobit doesn't worship at those shrines. He sneaks into Jerusalem to worship, even though he lives up in the north. He's married to Anna. She's an Israelite. They have a son named Tobias. And after he's taken into exile, he's not going to eat unclean Assyrian food. And he gets a rather high employment in the king of Assyria. And during that time, he has enough extra money. He deposits some of it in a city far away. And along the way, he becomes blind because of seagulls or something like that, right? Birds poop in his eyes and he can't see. So that's one part of the story that's set. Another part of a story in Ecbatana, or Ecbatana, however you want to say, there's the story of another Jewish family, happens to even be kinfolk. Raguel's the dad. He has a daughter named Sarah. And Sarah's been attacked by Asmodeus, this demon. And so you can see the demonic face there. And what the demon does is every time Sarah gets married, on their honeymoon night, he shows up and kills the groom. And this has happened to her 7 times. And so now you got these two kinds of stages set. And so Tobit's going to send his son to go get the money. And the son doesn't want to travel. And so he hires a companion who is the archangel Raphael, or just the angel Raphael in disguise. and he goes by the name of Azariah. And so as they set out on the trip, they stop at the Tigris River, they go fishing, they catch this massive fish, they save some of the parts of the fish, right? The heart, let's see, the heart, what is it? The liver and the bile, okay? And they get to Ecbatana, they stay with Raguel. As time unfolds, Tobias and Sarah fall in love. They're going to get married, and on the night of their honeymoon, he sets the heart and the liver, burns them as a sacrifice, sort of like what kind of incense that would be. But anyway, he burns them up, and the smell is so terrible that Asmodeus flees to Egypt. And Sarah and Tobias get married. When they eventually get themselves back home, they use the bile to rub on Tobit's eyes. He can see, and that's when Azariah reveals himself as Raphael the angel, and he eventually goes away, and they live happily ever after, right? That kind of sense. They live with joy to the end of their days, and the book closes with Tobit sort of predicting the destruction of Nineveh and the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And you think, rebuilding of Jerusalem, wait a minute, they hadn't destroyed Jerusalem yet. So here's an example of a story that's written later, telling about something that supposedly happened long ago, but you give some detail, and we'll have a fun little thing. Here's your hint. We'll have a fun little thing like this when we get to the New Testament. But anyway, you get the sense that just with some of the details, this has to be written later because they're referring to stuff in the past that anyway is there. But it's just kind of a fun story. And so we got a fish, we got a woman, and then there's 7 men who've died. There's a demon. I mean, this is Tobit. Anybody read Tobit before? Because you grew up Roman Catholic, so you might be aware of some of these stories.
I'm aware of the books, but
Okay.
I'm not aware of the stories.
Who wants to summarize Judith? Look what you have in Judith. You got a starved David, you got a woman, you got a dagger, you got a headless body. Oh, the head's over here in her hand.
Nope.
What's Judith about? Somebody read that. That's a short one. Go ahead, Lori.
Oh,
I'll give you a good one to read.
Violent woman. All right. Judith was possibly composed during the time of the oppressive Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid ruler of Syria. It tells of Nebuchadnezzar, here called the ruler of Assyria, not Babylon, defeating the Medes and then sending his general Holofernes to punish the local Israelites, Star of David, for refusing to support him. Holofernes lays siege to the town of Bethulia. Judith, one of the town's citizens and a beautiful and godly widow, is determined not to succumb to Holofernes' campaign. She prays fervently, puts on her brightest clothes, leaves Bethulia, and makes her way to Holofernes' camp. After Holofernes welcomes her, she declares that she has military secrets to share with him, offers to help him defeat her people, and proposes that she stay in his camp until this is achieved. She uses her feminine charms to ensnare him, and 4 nights later, while dining privately with a drunken Holofernes, she beheads him. Headless male figure sword. She then returns to Bethulia carrying the severed head with her, and the inhabitants greet her with great rejoicing. The Assyrians, who should have been Babylonians if Nebuchadnezzar was indeed their ruler, discover the fate that has overtaken their leader, and when the citizens of Bethulia attack them, they withdraw. The people of Bethulia then give thanks to God.
Isn't that a great bedtime story? Maybe not for a kid, but I mean, she's a hero. She, right? I mean, so this is kind of cool. So that's what this one's about. Then there are the additions to Esther. Again, Esther, you may realize, is one of only 2 books in the Bible that has no mention of God whatsoever. The additions take care of that. And there are 6 different editions. One is stuck right at the very beginning. And it's about Mordecai, who's taken into Babylon, exiled by Nebuchadnezzar. He has a dream about coming events. And then he warns the king about a threatened assassination attempt. And when it happens and they find out it's true, that they've been captured and questions, he has them executed. And then Haman is going to destroy Mordecai and the Jewish people. There's another insertion, shows up a few chapters later, where he draws up the edict to destroy the Jews. Then the next chapter, there's another little insertion that has the prayers that Esther and Mordecai prayed as they were getting ready to carry out their plan to rescue the people. And then there's an edition where Esther meets with the king and some more information that we didn't have before. Then several chapters later, we're told about the king annulling the decree. And then in the final which is right at the end of the book, Mordecai now understands the dream he has. It all makes sense. And it tells again how, interestingly enough, a letter that was sent out telling people about Purim was translated to Greek, taken down to Egypt, and while it doesn't mention it specifically, you get the sense, was put into the library in Alexandria. And so with the additions to Esther, if you were ever say to any Roman Catholic family or friends, it's really weird, Esther doesn't even mention God. Their version of Esther has all this. Are you kidding? There's a wonderful prayer. Let me read you this prayer of Esther. And so they'll read you the prayer of Esther and you go, I don't even find that's why. So there are additions to Esther. The next one is the Wisdom of Solomon. And the author, who claims to be Solomon, talks about wisdom in relationship to faith and everyday life. And wisdom is personified as a female celestial being. And so you see the female there in the symbol for God. And so that's what's happening in the Wisdom of Solomon. Syriac, or Ecclesiasticus, and you think, boy, I thought Ecclesiastes was hard to say. You got Ecclesiasticus, is a pretty big book. And there's a whole bunch of information in there. You can see that the first 43 chapters, subsection 1, talks about how the fear of the Lord and the keeping of the law needs to go hand in hand. The next section, which is 44 to 51, talks about the historical record of those who played a notable role in Israel's history. And it references the people. What's interesting, so these four famous people from our history, Solomon is referred to in a negative way. And remember, Solomon was supposed to be this great wise king, but he was also the one who married all those foreign women and started worshiping, set up for them to worship their gods, and then eventually himself worshiped their gods. So later on, further down the historical line, you look back to Solomon and say, oh man, he really messed us up. Our grandparents thought he was awesome, but now we know, right? Something different there. You good on that? Not like you're going to remember all these symbols, because I don't. Baruch is Jeremiah's scribe. And so in the book of Jeremiah, we'll hear about, for example, Baruch being the one who wrote down everything and then handed it in. And Jehoiakim, the religious leaders read it and thought, oh my gosh, we got to have the king read this. The king read it, and then he started cutting it apart and throwing it into his fire. That was all from Baruch. So Jeremiah and Baruch, this is then a pseudepigraphical writing, right? Somebody else taking the pen name of Baruch writes about this. It takes setting in Babylon, so you see the ziggurat. It also refers back to Jerusalem, so you see a skyline, but there's 4 primary sections. He's writing to the exiles and giving them a confession of sin. There's a prayer for pardon, a prayer of salvation, so you see some praying hands. He praises wisdom, so you see that lamp. And then there's the lament over the exiles, but this hope that they will soon be able to go back. Also included lots of times inside or at the end of Baruch is something separate called the letter of Jeremiah, but it's there again, supposedly written by Jeremiah, telling them that the exile is going to be long. Time is uncertain, so you've got a clock with a question mark in it. But idols, don't fall for the idols, don't worship the idols. They don't know anything, so it's really kind of a letter warning them about idolatry. Then, pretty interesting, there are additional stories that get attached to Daniel. And by the way, these additional stories are part of the quote unquote evidence that the scholars will use who claim that Daniel itself is written later. Doesn't matter, but just so you're aware of that. But the first is the prayer of Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So Abednego is Azariah, I think. Let me double look here. My memory doesn't hang on to all these things so much. Let's see. That's in chapter 1. They get their new names. Let's see. Here we go. Yes. So Hananiah, he called Shadrach. Mishael, he called Meshach. And Azariah, he called Abednego. So this would be, we know him as Abednego, but it's his prayer that he offers in the fiery furnace. And then the three of them are singing a song. So that's what that one is. This one's kind of interesting. It's another mystery story. Susanna, so that's the woman, is the righteous wife of a rich Jew living in Babylon. And there are two Jewish elders who have set their eyes on her and want her. And when they see her bathing, so you see kind of drops of water, you see the eyes, they confront her with a choice. And this story is probably the one that would have some pretty modern applications. Because two men in power say to her, you get with us and do what we want, or we're going to tell a lie about you that's going to get you killed. So they're pressuring her to have sex. She says, no, I'm not going to do it. And so they put her on trial. She's accused and found guilty. But all of a sudden, a young Daniel hears about this, steps in, retries the case, and proves that the two guys have been lying. So at the end of the story, they're killed. And Susanna is acquitted or whatever. It's kind of a cool story. Then Bel and the Dragon, two little stories about idolatry. And this would be a fun one for you to look at and read sometime. And I'm guessing you can find most of these online. So even if you don't have a Bible that has that, or you don't want to borrow one of ours, you can. But Cyrus, who is the king, is amazed that Daniel won't worship Bel. Because every night, the priest put food in him. And then the next morning, the food is gone. How can you not be in awe about this? And of course, Daniel finds out that there's this secret, we call it a trap door, kind of a secret trap door where the priests come in after the temple's closed, get rid of the food, and it's all a sham. And so when that happens, the king worships Daniel's God, destroys that Bel god, and kind of goes on. So it's this kind of, the priests are killed, all this sort of thing. And in the second story about the dragon, Daniel is thrown into a den of lions. It's another lion's den story because he refused to worship the dragon. But Haggai is sort of supernaturally transported from Jerusalem to go support Daniel for a little bit of time. And then when Daniel's released, he's fine. The accusers are thrown in and they get torn limb from limb. So it's kind of another Daniel in the lion's den story. Bel and the Dragon. Now you get into some history. First Maccabees it outlines the events that take place with Judas Maccabeus and his father Mattathias and his brother John and Simon, who eventually defeat Antiochus IV Epiphanes and take control and set up the Maccabean succession of power, trying to cleanse the temple. And that whole story that leads to the celebration of the festival of Hanukkah is all a part of what's listed in First Maccabees. So besides the stories like the additions to Daniel and Judith and Tobit, if you're inclined to read any of these books, First Maccabees would definitely be one you want to look at because it sets that story. Second Maccabees covers much of the same period of time, but so here you have the Greek the Greek helmet and the tower symbolizing the Greeks. You've got the fight, you've got the Star of David and the temple. So that's what's happening in First Maccabees. Second Maccabees has some of the similar things. It's also a fun little book to read. Here, Antiochus is trying to impose Hellenism on this family, and they're going to be put to death, but it's all about resisting the king and his efforts. And this is a book that makes a pretty significant reference to about the resurrection from the dead and not just Sheol and the shades. So here's the woman and her 7 children and the pig crossed out. It's kind of a goofy looking pig, but you can kind of see what it is there. First Esdras, interestingly enough, is essentially a retelling of what you see in the latter part of Second Chronicles, the book of Ezra, and a couple of chapters from Nehemiah. But it does have a section in it that is not otherwise known, which is called the Debate of the Three Youths, in which there's this contest in the Persian court of Darius of what's the most powerful. Is it wine? And so you see this wine goblet and a question mark. Is it women? And you see 2 women. Or is it truth? And in the end, truth is proven to be the most powerful of all. And the one who argues that point in this debate is Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel then uses it as an opportunity to remind Darius that they're supposed to be able to go back and rebuild the temple and stuff in Jerusalem. And of course, Zerubbabel is one of the ones who leads a group of people back in that case. Then, Second Esdras, which is a big section, as you can see here. Interestingly enough, the first 2 chapters of Second Esdras are thought to be a Christian writing and not a Jewish writing. And so you can see that it is listed there. Chapters 3 through 12 and chapters 13 and 14 are Jewish writings that are believed to be produced AD 100. So these are writings that are after Jesus' time. And you can see that they're apocalyptic. And so there's several visions that are listed. And I don't have to read those to you. But there's this sense of this is a process of 40 or 400 or 1,000, some of these numbers that start to show up in the book of Revelation that we'll get to way down the road from here. But you can see the explanation below on page 128. There's the prayer of Manasseh. One of the interesting things you might remember when we went through the book of Chronicles, we looked at how it told some of the history differently than we had read in Kings. And some of the differences were just information that we hadn't been given with Kings, but some of it was contrasting information. For example, when Solomon made arrangements with Hiram of Tyre to get some of the building materials he needed to build the temple. Kings tells us that Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in Galilee, and that Hiram didn't like it. When the story is told in Chronicles, Hiram gives Solomon 20 cities, so the exchange is reversed. Who knows? But the other thing was interesting is we were told in Kings that Manasseh was the worst king the South ever had. And if I'm remembering right, he was Hezekiah's son, who was one of the best kings they ever had. And so one of the best kings they ever had a son who was one of the worst kings they ever had. And he ruled 55 years. Well, when we get to hearing about Manasseh in Chronicles, we hear about a conversion experience that's not talked about in Kings. And this prayer of Manasseh then claims to be the prayer that he prayed. And so here you have the king down on his knees praying, apology to God because he's carried off into Babylon, and he gets there and realizes I've made so many bad choices. So that's what the prayer of Manasseh is about. Psalm 151, supposedly composed by David after he killed Goliath. And so you see a big giant guy with his head chopped off. And you can see, can't you, that this guy over here is bigger than this guy over here, or this head here is smaller than this head here. So this is big giant Goliath being killed, and David extols God himself as God's champion. There's a 3 Maccabees, which is really not the right name for it, because it talks about things that happened even before the Maccabees showed up. So it talks about some of the fighting between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And in one of those areas, it's the 3rd bullet point, Ptolemy is so mad that because he was going from temple to temple to collect whatever wealth he could from those temples. Remember, the temples were ancient repositories for wealth. The Jews wouldn't let him in Jerusalem. So when he gets back to Egypt, he's going to kill all the Jews. He puts a whole bunch of them in an amphitheater and lets loose 500 drunk elephants who are supposed to just go mad crazy and trample them all. But what happens instead is they trample only Egyptians. And so the king repents, he frees the Jews, gives them a feast, and sends them home. So again, it has that kind of story to it. And so you got the Jewish people who are praising God, you got the crazy elephant, you got a symbol for your Greek king with the pyramid, so he's a Ptolemy. And then finally, 4 Maccabees is just a focus on wisdom. It raises the question of resurrection of the body. And it talks about a woman with 7 sons, again, being put to death for their refusal to eat pork. So that's a quick summary of the Apocrypha. And you're probably not going to remember hardly any of it. But if you can spend some time looking at it, it would be helpful. So again, look at the one paper handout I gave you, this time to the front side. And you can see that I listed the books in the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanonical books that are included in all Orthodox and Roman Catholic Bibles. So those are the ones that are listed. Then the Greek Orthodox Bible includes those additional writings besides the ones listed above. And then the Slavonic, amongst the Slavs, their Orthodox Bible includes the ones that are listed there. So you can see they're not the same, but there are some similarities. And then if it isn't already too confusing, look at that last little section at the bottom. Ezra and Nehemiah are called different things in different Bibles. So in the Bible that we use, as well as the Apocrypha writings, there's the book of Ezra. The Greek Bible, it's called Second Esdras. The Latin Bible is called First Ezra. And in the Slavonic Bible, it's First Esdras. Isn't that confusing already? Nehemiah is also Second Esdras in the Greek Bible. So that's why sometimes you will see Ezra dash Nehemiah listed that way. It's called Second Ezra in the Latin Bible. It's called Nehemiah in the Slavonic Bible. And then you have First Esdras in our Apocrypha, which is First Esdras in the Greek Bible. It's Third Ezra in the Latin Bible, and it's Second Esdras in the Slavonic Bible. And then Second Esdras in our Apocrypha isn't included in the Greek Bible. It's Fourth Ezra in the Latin Bible and Third Esdras in the Slavonic Bible. So notice the Latin Bible will have Ezra 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the little note that in some of the Latin Bibles, it's broken down a little bit differently, so you could have as many as 6 Ezras. Just what it is. Okay? Now you got a sheet with the Pseudepigrapha. Grab that paper sheet for a minute. I don't have a slide for that. Those are all the writings that are included in these 2 volumes that I showed you. They are listed in a strange alphabetical way. The doesn't count, which sometimes is common. But if it is, for example, look at the first one. You could say, oh, Apocalypse of Abraham, Apocalypse of Adam, those all start with A, but Testament of Adam starts with a T. Yeah, but it's Adam. Okay, so it's Abraham, Adam, Adam and Eve, Ahikar, Orestes, etc. So they are in order, but not necessarily by the first word. See how that works? And now you'll notice that there are some that are in bold print and underlined. Those in bold print and underlined are what are referred to in this graphic that I have up on the screen. And so it's only these ones in bold print and underlined that we're going to talk about super briefly. But let's take a look. Oh, there. Here's the Pseudepigrapha. So these are the ones we're going to look at. There are a bunch of things connected to Enoch. Enoch is this very interesting character that we read about in Genesis chapter 5. 5? I think 5. Because we're told that Enoch walks with God, and God took him, and he was no more. And he lived 365 years, which is kind of interesting, 365 days in a calendar. But anyway, and so this is one of these books written as if Enoch was writing, even though it comes much later. And as you can see, page 131, most of page 131 talks about the Enoch, first Enoch literature. It's in a book like this that we hear stories about Son of Man. And the phrase Son of Man shows up in Ezekiel. It shows up in Daniel. And then it starts to show up in these Apocryphal writings. Of course, this is the term that Jesus will use to refer to himself in the Gospels. And Son of Man in the Bible can just be a reference to a human being. But it's also a reference to the Jewish people as a whole. Sometimes it's understood in that way. But it's also a reference to this coming messianic figure. And so again, it depends kind of on the context. And you can see some of the information about that. But there's quite a few chapters, right? It talks about the first section, which is 36 chapters. And then you got a second section that goes all the way to chapter 71. So it's a long writing. But somebody read the first paragraph that shows up underneath all the bullet points.
The Book of Enoch contains some significant teachings. It describes the future life in terms of earthly pleasure and says that marriage and family life will be part of the scene, heavenly cloud, parents, children. Note Mark 12:18 through 27. Sheol is no longer just a place to which all the dead go, but a place where the wicked are punished, flames, male, female figures. The book contains numerous references to angels and ascribes names to them. Fallen angels referred to in the first section were those who sinned with women, winged figures, female frame-mounted symbol. Genesis 6:1 through 4. They introduced women to such evils as weapons, cosmetics, and enchantments. The offsprings of these evil unions were destroyed by the flood, but their spirits still roam about the earth and cause much evil. The wicked angels are subject to one particular demon, Satan. However, more than one angel act as a Satan or adversary.
Okay, so again, just kind of gives you a little bit of some of the stuff that would be stewing around in the people's minds, and that last paragraph references the Son of Man. Second Enoch has reference to a period of a millennium, 1,000 years, that planet Earth is going to last 7,000 years. And then there's this period of 1,000-year millennium that follows. So you got the 7,000 plus the 1,000. Don't be surprised if you hear some debate about this, because there are a group within the Christian family who use the numbers in the Bible very literally and want to insist that the world is about 6,000 years old. So if this Enoch literature could be kind of interesting in 1,000 years, but who knows how that plays out. But that's what's happening in Second Enoch. Third Enoch is the one that talks about these levels of heaven, the seventh heaven, some of that terminology that we hear. And Paul will make reference to someone he knows who was taken up to the third heaven. So some of that language is there. That's Enoch. Then you got the Book of Jubilees, which is kind of interesting, because here it uses lots of things with numbers. It divides the history of the world into 49 periods of 49 years. And so you got lots of 49s here. It has an approval of the Sabbath, so we got a check mark by the Sabbath. It talks about dietary laws, so we got a check mark by the food. It speaks out against the nudity that would be part of the Greek Olympic Games, right? Remember, the original Olympic athletes didn't have uniforms. They were in their birthday suits, right? So now you got kind of like a naked runner crossed out. It has only one reference to a messianic figure, a prince descended from Judah, but it talks about how you'll have salvation through observance of the law. Doesn't nearly have the kind of interest in angels and demons, but it does have classes of them. So you get some of that evil angels, good angels, different classes and levels. That's the Book of Jubilees. The next book is the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. In Genesis, we read about how Jacob blessed each of his 12 sons. This writing takes it further, that each of those 12 sons in turn will have blessings that are spoken. And so each one of these things are there. So you have what would be Jacob with 12 sons, and each of those 12 sons speak 12 blessings. And so you get this pattern, and you can see the pattern as it occurs below. Some of the things in this book appear to be Christian, so they may have been writings that were continuing to be tinkered with. But eventually, here you have a demonology, which is the fancy term for when you start describing both names and ranks and what's the other word? Names and ranks and tasks or characteristics or qualities of what the different demons might do. But eventually the high priest is going to overcome him. But about the fourth line up from the bottom, it says, Beliar is the leader of the forces of evil. So that term Beliar, we'll see it as Belial in the New Testament. So that's going to show up there. The letter of Orestes is interesting. It is supposedly the story of how the Hebrew Bible got translated into Greek. So if you're interested in reading anyone, this one might be an interesting one to read. Then guess what? There's a whole bunch of Baruch literature. Second Baruch, because we already had a first Baruch in the Apocrypha. This is visions that he had after the fall of Jerusalem. So you see kind of what's left of a wall here. And the visions explain that the tragedy and the ensuing suffering of the Jewish people and visions of the last time, a messianic banquet and the resurrection of the dead. So we'll hear about some more of these things. So here's this bunch of food and a chalice for the banquet. Here is a resurrection of the dead, even though it wouldn't talk about a tomb with a stone rolled away, but we get used to that when we get to Jesus. Third Baruch has another name. The Greek Apocalypse of Baruch talks about an angel taking Baruch to the fifth heaven and showing him numerous things. And again, we have lots of angels and guardians, angels serving as guardians and mediators. So we got him going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then there's the prayers of Solomon, 18 different psalms composed by Jews in Palestine, probably in that first century BC. Some of the references, like when Ptolemy, the emperor of Rome, comes in and overruns Jerusalem, you can kind of see some things that are there. But it is interesting that the Psalms sort of say that God allowed these invasions to happen because the kings were bad and the priests were bad. And of course, those particular bad kings, bad priests were part of those Hasmoneans who tried to not only continue, remember, Judas wanted to cleanse the temple. He wanted to be able to worship God again, but his descendants began eventually to consolidate and keep power. One of the last ones we'll look at is the Sibylline oracles. Sibyls comes out of the Greek history. About 500 BC, you can see he refers to this prophetess. So Sibyls are always women, and quite often older women. They were filled with divine spirit and be able to be channels through whom the gods could deliver messages to people. So interestingly enough, it says in the middle of that section that both Jews and Christians imitated the pagan practice and composed Sibylline oracles of their own. Most have been lost, some have survived, but the future of the world history is there. Beliar is going to get destroyed. The Jews will ultimately triumph. The Messiah will come. And in some of these, Noah's daughter is the Sibyl who speaks to them. So you see this coming Messiah, the king's canceled out, the Jews are going to win, these kinds of things, the anointed one. The last is Testament of Moses. Again, debate. Some thought there were two different works, the Testament and the Assumption, but what we have is the Testament. And in this, you hear about the future history of Israel, both within the land of Canaan and the conquest. The Greeks will come. And in fact, it's sort of interesting how it references that in BC, 4 BC to AD 30. But eventually, the Jews are going to overcome Roman domination. So those are some of the themes that show up in these writings that you and I have never read, probably never will read, but they help to set the stage for what we will encounter. And we're going to do something a little different to end our lesson today. We're actually going to read the summary points now. We'll come back to them next week, but I think they do a great job of summarizing what we've read. So who can read 39a?
In addition to the books of the Hebrew Scriptures and the Protestant Old Testament, other Jewish writings exist that date from the period 200 BC through AD 100. These works are referred to as the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Both collections give valuable insights into ideas and teachings that developed during the period 200 BC through AD 100. Some of the issues that surface within them are the hope that the Jewish nation will eventually rule the world, the faith that will eventually overtake the culture and military might of other nations, the origin of sin, the existence and role of heavenly beings, both good and evil, the concept of wisdom, the cosmic signs that will precede the breaking in of the Messianic age, the nature of life after death.
And if you have an or in the fourth bullet, if yours says the existence and role or heavenly beings, you got to change that to an F of heavenly beings. So those are some of those points. Thank you, Jace. Somebody read B.
Although many Christian Bibles contain the apocryphal writings, the number of writings included varies. Section 39C lists 18 apocryphal books. The term apocrypha is derived from a Greek word meaning hidden. It was eventually applied to those sacred books whose orthodoxy was questioned. Although it was conceded that these writings are edifying and have value for private study, they were not seen as inspired, nor were they read in public worship. The Roman Catholic Church includes 7 apocryphal writings in its canon and refers to them as deuterocanonical. The Orthodox Church includes 12 apocryphal writings in its Old Testament canon. The Pseudepigrapha is another collection of intertestamental writings. The name denotes that they are pseudonymous.
Yep.
Their authorship is ascribed falsely to an ancient person. Although 13 of these writings are listed in section 39D, more are being added to the list. The Roman Catholic Church refers to these writings and the 3 apocryphal books it denies a place among its deuterocanonical books as the Apocrypha.
So that last line's a little confusing. So remember, what we Protestants called the Apocrypha, the Roman Catholics called deuterocanonical. And then some of the things that all the deuterocanonical books are accepted by the Orthodox Church, but they also accept some other ones. But the Roman Catholics don't. So the ones the Roman Catholics don't, plus the pseudepigraphical writings, are what they call the Apocrypha. But we call it the Pseudepigrapha. So anyway, confusing. Go ahead. Somebody C.
The apocryphal writings vary in content and focus. Tobit, Judith, the additions to Esther, the additions to Daniel, Susanna, Bel and the Dragon, 1, 2, 3, and 4 Maccabees are narrative writings. The Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Baruch, and 1 Esdras focuses on the concept of wisdom. The letter of Jeremiah and 2 Esdras offer meaning and hope to God's suffering people. The prayer of Manasseh is a prayer that a repentant king Manasseh is said to have prayed after being taken into exile in Babylon. Psalm 151 was supposedly prayed by David after he killed Goliath.
Okay. And D. Come on, Kathy with a C.
You're okay, sorry. Getting back, I can't hear it. The contents of the pseudepigraphical writings resemble those of the apocryphal writings. Much of the literature focuses on end time events. The Book of Jubilees divides the history of the world from creation to Sinai into 49 periods of 49 years. Among other things, it attacks Greeks and pagan practices. In the Testaments of the 12 patriarchs, Jacob's 12 sons give farewell deathbed speeches to their offspring. The letter of Aristeas describes events having to do with the translation of the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. Second and third Baruch contain numerous visions that have to do with the end time. The Psalms of Solomon explain why God permitted the Romans to invade Judah in 63 BC and define some messianic hopes. In the Sibylline oracles, Noah's daughter provides information about what will take place in the end time. In the Testament of Moses, Moses outlines the history of God's people from the time of the conquest until the breaking in of the Messianic age. He also assures the Jewish people that they will eventually prevail over their Roman overlord.
Okay, so particularly the first couple of points hopefully set that stage for what we're doing. Let's go ahead and join in these prayers, and then if you'd like, I will read to you one of those books. It's not very long. Lord, make us instruments of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, love. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Save us from the time of trial, and deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. So we will, next time, move to a focus on the hopes that developed for what it would be like when Messiah comes. And then we'll launch after that into the New Testament. So if you're interested, I'm going to read Susanna. If you'd like to stay, feel free. If not, feel free to move on. There was a man living in Babylon whose name was Joachim. He married the daughter of Hilkiah named Susanna, a very beautiful woman, and one who feared the Lord. Her parents were righteous and had trained their daughter according to the law of Moses. Joachim was very rich and had a fine garden adjoining the house. The Jews used to come to him because he was the one most honored of them all. That year, 2 elders from the people were appointed as judges. Concerning them, the Lord had said, wickedness comes forth from Babylon, from elders who were judges, who were supposed to govern the people. These men were frequently at Joachim's house, and all who had a case to be tried came to them there. When the people left at noon, Susanna would go into her husband's garden to walk. Every day, the 2 elders used to see her going in and walking about, and they began to lust for her. They suppressed their consciences and turned away their eyes from looking to heaven or remembering their duty to administer justice. Both were overwhelmed with passion for her, but they did not tell each other of their distress, for they were ashamed to disclose their lustful desire to seduce her. Day after day, they watched eagerly to see her. One day they said to each other, let us go home, for it is time for lunch. So they both left and parted from each other. But turning back, they met again. And when each pressed the other for the reason, they confessed their lust. Then together, they arranged for a time when they could find her alone. Once, while they were watching for an opportune day, she went in as before with only 2 maids and wished to bathe in the garden, for it was a hot day. No one was there except the two elders, who had hidden themselves and were watching her. She said to her maids, "Bring me olive oil and ointments, and shut the garden doors so that I can bathe." They did as she told them. They shut the doors of the garden and went out by the side doors to bring what they had been commanded. They did not see the elders because they were hiding. When the maids had gone out, the two elders got up and ran to her. They said, "Look, the garden doors are shut, and no one can see us. We are burning with desire for you, so give your consent and lie with us. If you refuse, we will testify against you that a young man was with you, and this was why you sent your maids away." Susanna groaned and said, "I am completely trapped, for if I do this, it will mean death for me. If I do not, I cannot escape your hands. I choose not to do it. I will fall into your hands rather than sin in the sight of the Lord." Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice, and the two elders shouted against her, and one of them ran and opened the garden doors. When the people in the house heard the shouting in the garden, they rushed in at the side door to see what had happened to her. And when the elders told their story, the servants felt very much ashamed, for nothing like this had ever been said about Susanna. The next day, when the people gathered at the house of her husband Joachim, the two elders came, full of their wicked plot to have Susanna put to death. In the presence of the people, they said, "Send for Susanna, daughter of Hilkiah, the wife of Joachim." So they sent for her, and she came with her parents, her children, and all her relatives. Now Susanna was a woman of great refinement and beautiful in appearance. As she was veiled, the scoundrels ordered her to be unveiled, so that they might feast their eyes on her beauty. Those who were with her and all who saw her were weeping. Then the two elders stood up before the people and laid their hands on her head. Through her tears, she looked up toward heaven, for her heart trusted in the Lord. The elders said, "While we were walking in the garden alone, this woman came in with two maids, shut the garden doors, and dismissed the maids. Then a young man who was hiding there came to her and lay with her. We were in the corner of the garden, and when we saw this wickedness, we ran to them. Although we saw them embracing, we could not hold the young man because he was stronger than we, and he opened the doors and got away. We did, however, seize this woman and asked who the young man was, but she would not tell us. These things we testify." Because they were elders of the people and judges, the assembly believed them and condemned her to death. Then Susanna cried out with a loud voice and said, "O eternal God, you know what is secret and are aware of all things before they come to be. You know that these men have given false evidence against me, and now I am to die, though I have done none of the wicked things that they have charged against me." The Lord heard her cry. Just as she was being led off to execution, God stirred up the Holy Spirit of a young lad named Daniel, and he shouted with a loud voice, "I want no part in shedding this woman's blood." All the people turned to him and asked, "What is this that you are saying?" Taking his stand among them, he said, "Are you such fools, O Israelites, as to condemn a daughter of Israel without examination and without learning the facts? Return to court, for these men have given false evidence against her." So all the people hurried back, and the rest of the elders said to him, "Come, sit among us and inform us, for God has given you the standing of an elder." Daniel said to them, "Separate them far from each other, and I will examine them." When they were separated from each other, he summoned one of them and said to him, "You old relic of wicked ways, your sins have now come home, which you have committed in the past, pronouncing unjust judgments, condemning the innocent and acquitting the guilty. Though the Lord said, 'You shall not put the innocent and righteous person to death.' Now then, if you really saw this woman, tell me this: under what tree did you see them being intimate with each other?" He answered, "Under a mastic tree." And Daniel said, "Very well, this lie has cost you your head, for the angel of God has received the sentence from God and will immediately cut you in two." Then, putting him to one side, he ordered them to bring the other. And he said to him, "You offspring of Canaan and not of Judah, beauty has beguiled you, and lust has perverted your heart. This is how you have been treating the daughters of Israel, and they were intimate with you through fear. But her daughter of Judah would not tolerate your wickedness. Now then, tell me, under which tree did you catch them being intimate with each other? He answered, under an evergreen oak. Daniel said to him, very well, this lie has cost you also your head, for the angel of God is waiting with his sword to split you in two, so as to destroy you both. Then the whole assembly raised a great shout and blessed God, who saves those who hope in him. And they took action against the two elders, because out of their own mouths Daniel had convicted them of bearing false witness. They did to them as they had wickedly planned to do to their neighbor. Acting in accordance with the law of Moses, they put them to death. Thus innocent blood was spared that day. Hilkiah and his wife praised God for their daughter Susanna, and so did her husband Joachim and all her relatives, because she was found innocent of a shameful deed. And from that day onward, Daniel had a great reputation among the people. Truth will prevail.